Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I'm a detransition male, and today is my great honor to have Dr. Michael Bailey on my channel to talk about all things autogynephilia. So Dr. Michael Bailey is an American psychologist, behavioral geneticist, and professor at Northwestern University, best known for his work on the etiology of sexual orientation and paraphilia. As professor for 35 years and a researcher for over 40, Bailey has published over 100 academic articles. Dr. Bailey is a leading expert on the topic of autogynephilia, the phenomenon of males being aroused by the thought or image of themselves as female. In 2003, Bailey wrote The Man Who Would Be Queen, a book that examines gender identity, sexual orientation, and the role of autogynephilia in male to female transgender experiences. I'm sure everyone who listens to my channel is super familiar with your work. And I wanted to start off with your new publication in Reality's Last Stand, which I read, which is very interesting. I was wondering if you could summarize your disagreement with Dr. Joe Burgo in regards to autogynephilia and the psychoanalytic approach to this phenomenon, and both his criticism of the more sexological approach, the more empirical approach, and like your problems with the psychoanalytic approach.
Okay, so I don't know Joe Burgo, and I've only read a little bit about his ideas about autogynephilia, and that was enough to form an opinion, because he, his evidence consists of his experience with a very few patients that he's had in therapy, psychotherapy, I'm guessing 10 or fewer. And his approach, so it wouldn't matter to me what kind of therapy one was doing. Psychotherapy data are not very good for learning things about any phenomenon. They're good about forming hypotheses. You talk to somebody, you say, "Oh, that's interesting." You talk to 3 or 4, and you say, "Oh, that's interesting. They have some things in common. I wonder." And then you got to actually do empirical work to see if your hypotheses are correct. And Burgo has not done any of that. Now, psychoanalysis does have special problems, because the lens through which psychoanalysts view their patients is murky and distorted. Freud was a terrible scientist. His ideas, to the extent that they are scientifically able to be evaluated, have been discredited by and large. There have been subsequent psychoanalysts who follow in Freud's tradition, which is talk to somebody, don't bother to collect any kind of systematic data. Whatever the authority in your particular line of psychoanalysis says is gospel, and that's all you need. It's kind of like the Bible. Burgo seems to like the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, who, her ideas were formed by observing infants and speculating about what they were thinking and feeling. So psychoanalysis is terrible science. And I say that as somebody who went through a Freudian phase in a little after college. And once I learned about science, it was very easy to eject my Freudian influences. And, I'm a little aggravated, I suppose. I'm sure Joe Burgo is an intelligent man and probably a nice man, even though I don't know him. But I'm a little irritated uh, that he has been seen as an expert on autogynephilia, anything really, that by anything requiring, other than, I guess he's an expert on Kleinian psychoanalysis, but he's certainly not an expert on autogynephilia. And the gender critical folks, they seem to have loose criteria in who they see as an expert on certain things. And with respect to autogynephilia, the main criterion seems to me to be anybody who has negative opinions about autogynephilia might get labeled as an expert.
Right.
Obviously, trans activists are at least as bad, but we don't really need to. Burgo is not seen as an expert by that side.
Right. So I think one reason why some of the people in the gender critical world like Burgo's approach is because he sort of framed a lot of this discussion under the concept of ROGD boys as a sort of purported third type that's distinct from the HSTS versus the AGP type. And and the argument is that this seems to be coming from parental reports, and they sort of say like, well, my boy doesn't sound like one of these, older, married, perverted, fetishistic transvestites, who are, porn addled or whatever. My boy is sweet, sensitive, autistic, low sex drive, emotionally not very well developed. And, he's not spending all his time, masturbating to internet pornography, and this is like a sweet, sensitive young boy who's autistic. And so there's trying to make the argument that this is like a distinct phenomenon that's analogous to what we see in the young adolescent females with the RGD, and like that's phenomenal. So I'm wondering if you could respond to that line of argumentation, saying that like, there's like a new phenomenon happening amongst like the younger male cohort.
So I have done research on ROGD. And I'm very familiar with the concept, and I actually endorse the concept, the theory of ROGD as it applies to natal females. It exists. It explains, I believe, the epidemic in transgender identification and gender dysphoria in that demographic. And the idea of ROGD is that there are these cultural memes, like, and especially attractive to psychologically troubled youth, adolescents and young adults, that, you have problems. Are you sad? Maybe it's because you're trans and not aware of it, and if your friend identifies as transgender, that is an influence on you identifying. And anybody who's ever been around adolescents, perhaps especially troubled adolescents, sees that as quite plausible. And it's a hypothesis that could also pertain to natal males. However, we have a pre-existing hypothesis that likely explains cases of adolescent onset gender dysphoria for natal males, and that's autogynephilia. Again, I'm not saying that I know that the male analog of ROGD doesn't exist. Maybe it does. However, we know for sure that I'm going to say AGP for short. I assume
Yeah,
your
that's fine.
audience that AGP uh, gender dysphoria exists in adolescent males. That's when it starts. And these days, a lot of AGP males are getting the idea that, hey, maybe I should transition, and their gender dysphoria is more common. I think I would speculate among AGP males during adolescence than it used to be when it was. I think 50 years ago it was commonly understood to be this strange sexuality that they had and kept secret. Um, so, what the something you said about parents thinking that they know about the sexuality of their kids, I doubt it. I'm a typical straight guy, and my mother knew very little about my sex life, I believe, and not that I had much of it as an adolescent, but the parents don't know that much unless they uh, find pornography, uh, and then maybe they'll have a little better idea, unless their adolescent talks to them about their sex lives. I don't think that's very common
Right.
among AGP boys. Now, I do want to say that with Phil Illy and another guy who's not autogynephilic, I've conducted a research study of gender variant males, and that includes some males who identify as autogynephilic. And we've looked into the extent to which uh, their parents knew. And it happens sometimes, rarely because they told their parents in adolescence anyway. Sometimes parents found things. They found their panties, something like that. Now, would the parents automatically attribute that to autogynephilia as opposed to something else? I guess it depends. But more often, it is the exception that parents know these things. And gender critical thinkers, and I'm friendly with many of these. I'm friendly with most people who don't attack me. And this includes people like, say, Stella O'Malley, who, while she does grant that AGP happens, she seems to prefer the idea that true ROGD exists among natal males. And she talks about, these autistic, gentle boys and so on. But, in the survey that we uh, just conducted, and I'll be writing about this on Reality's Last Stand, the rate of autism diagnosis is very similar to the rate that we obtained in an earlier study of ROGD males. They look very
Right.
similar to these ROGD males in various things. So I am skeptical, but not dismissive of the idea that um, a male analog of female ROGD exists. I am certainly insistent that we don't have good evidence that it does yet.
Right.
And finally, we definitely know that adolescent onset AGP related gender dysphoria does exist in males and causes, you know, transgender identification in some, but not all males with it. Uh,
Right.
So, and parents, the gender critical. So one thing that I want to do in a series of essays I'll be writing for Colin Wright's Substack, Reality's Last Stand, is to put the evidence out there. As you know, I'm not hesitant to make anybody mad, including including AGPs. Um, I say what is true to the best of my knowledge, and I have a lot of knowledge about AGP. But anyway, I want to put the best evidence out there and try to get the gender criticals to be more evidence based about AGP and less hostile and hysterical in some cases about
Right.
AGP. I'm talking about the Kelly J. Keens, for example, who think that all AGPs are potential sex offenders and so on. They're not.
There does seem to be, in my mind, like not really like a contradiction between ROGD and autogynephilia, because they seem to work together. Because in one sense, there's like ROGD is like a hypothesis that it's purely a social contagion. And then there's another sense in which it's really just a phenomenological description of how dysphoria can kind of ramp up relatively quickly that wasn't otherwise there. For example, there seems to be like a large majority of the contemporary HB cohort. They'll say things like, I don't have strong bottom dysphoria. I don't really hate my body that much. But I'm sort of like, think I would be happier or more euphoric, feminizing to some degree or another. And then they go into these Reddit communities or these Discord communities, and there's a lot of, sort of what they call pink pilling or egg cracking or sort of encouraging transition. And so in these cases, the dysphoria in terms of like hating one's body can rapidly develop after you set the goal of transition for yourself. And that was certainly true in like my case. I did not have strong repulsion to my male body, but once I set the goal to transition, then suddenly I started hating things like, I started having dysphoria about my Adam's apple or my voice, even though going through puberty, I didn't have that dislike. That those things didn't make me they didn't give me discomfort. But as soon as I made it the goal to take on this social script of living life as a trans woman, then suddenly I started developing this like intense dislike of all these things about my masculine body that were incongruent with that new social identity of like a trans woman. So in that sense, I do think that like there's this like cohort that's sort of possibly different from the more traditional classical case where like they've always sort of like deeply, hated their bodies, especially their genitals, and sought out bottom surgery as like this sort of like classical, like ultimate treatment. So I'm curious if you can speak to that sort of newer cohort that, is comfortable with their penis. They sort of maybe even like don't even want to imitate females. They sort of are more imitating like, femboys or transsexuals. They sort of like sort of idolize transsexual women and sort of explicitly identify not as like women, but as like T girls or something like this. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
So I think that what you just said, at the beginning, you said something that I thought was I agree with and very thoughtful, and the way I understood what you said is that there can be an ROGD-like component because of culture. Given even that, say, a male has ROGD, if he finds himself in a culture where he can have contact with other people like him, other teenage boys with AGP, and they get to talking, and they come up with the brilliant idea that transitioning is what everybody should do, then that's going to make that desire more likely, powerful, and that decision more likely. Um, and then you said something about cohorts, and I just want to make sure that I understand what you mean. I think you're wanting to distinguish earlier cohorts of AGP males from recent cohort of AGP. Is that right? And
Yes.
and so I think that we uh, so first there's always been a lot of variability in males with AGP, and some who would just live their lives as cross dressers, some who a few, I'm talking about like 50 years ago, say, or 40 anyway, through Ray Blanchard's work, he would have contact with some who even prior to uh, much sexual experience would uh, try to uh, get sex reassignment surgery. And then you would also have a lot of cases who would have a family and then say, and that it's not that they discovered their autogynephilia after late. They always had it. They were cross dressers. Then they got married, and then they had this. I really need to transition, and the latter phenomenon I've always thought was akin to typical, say, straight males midlife crisis. Where he needs to leave his wife and family for his lover, when he's 50 or whatever. And so there's always been that variability. I think that what has changed somewhat is that with the internet, it's much easier to find other people than it used to be, because it used to be that this was a very this was a thing that people would have, and they would they cross dress erotically and so on, and then maybe in adulthood they would find other cross dressers and join a society, or maybe go out cross dressing together. But now you can you have uh, an autogynephilic fantasy. You can find others on the internet very quickly.
Right.
And people may not be talking about autogynephilia. They may be saying, cursing the idea of autogynephilia, even though they're autogynephilic. Uh,
Right.
but so, about the variation that you were specifically talking about, which is people who, you know, I don't know. It sounded like maybe you were talking about people who had maybe milder versions of
Yeah.
autogynephilia,
Yeah.
or maybe not focusing on having a vulva, but having a feminized body, but not go all the way to SRS.
Right.
I don't. Yeah, certainly that those kinds of people going to gender clinics and trying to get treatment, I don't think happened 40 years ago, though. I'm not a clinician. You're going to be talking to Ray Blanchard if you haven't already, so ask him. Um, I think that we didn't even have the concept of autogynephilia until the mid to late 80s, when Ray came up with it. So less than 40 years ago. And he worked at a gender clinic. That's where he got his data. I think he was very thorough about talking to these people and collecting data on them, but we didn't know a lot about autogynephilic males outside of gender clinics. And nobody knows this, but my guess is that a fairly small minority of males with autogynephilia seek some kind of medicalized treatment or social transition.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, if we buy into the idea that this is like comes on a spectrum, or if, like a variety of different presentations of, and the severity or uh, uh, of the dysphoria, or like the parts about yourself that you are dysphoric about, or whether it's, there's autoandrophobia. I also want to ask you about that concept later. Um, it does seem like if we buy into that spectrum idea, then, it does seem like the difference between contemporary gender medicine and maybe like 30, 40 years ago was like, nowadays, if you have mild dysphoria, there's, in terms of making that trade-off decision that all AGPs do, in terms of like, do I sacrifice my life as a man and all these things, or so it's like they're always making these trade-off calculations about whether transition is a good thing. Well, now there's more incentives for people with the milder forms, or maybe not incentives, but there's less roadblocks socially to do that. And also there's so much um, representation of AGPs, even if they're not self-identified, but there's so many of them. And from so many AGPs, they'll say things like, well, it really got kicked off, when I saw a transsexual on Jerry Springer, and that kind of got my imagination going. I just got obsessed with that once I got exposed to that sort of like social clue, or it's like, or I saw Bugs Bunny cross-dressed, and that really got me fascinated by that. You sort of get exposed to these examples of gender bending, and that kind of like can sort of, I think, unlock this like obsession for some AGPs. Well, now it's like those triggers, or those like examples, are so much more prevalent in our culture. You cannot avoid them. They're everywhere. Like Dylan Mulvaney on TikTok getting millions and millions and millions of views, and these, being exposed, and all the big celebrities, and it's just like trans is everywhere. So it seems like in that sense, if these things are kind of, if like the underlying AGP disposition needs to be triggered by that kind of like possibility model to imitate of, then it's like there's way more of that in today's culture.
So I'm not sure that I find that something you just implied to be very plausible, that the underlying AG, well, maybe I don't understand it, so let's clarify it. So the underlying AGP predisposition needs to be triggered. Do you mean to be triggered in order to experience the sexual arousal, or do you mean to become gender dysphoric?
Yeah, the like latter. It's like
Oh,
it's
okay.
more
Yeah,
it's like
yeah,
more so
yeah,
in terms of starting to, what
yeah,
would motivate you to start Googling, like why do I feel like a girl, or like,
yeah,
you start Googling about gender bending and stuff
yeah,
because you saw that, and then now you're
yeah,
curious about it, and you go look it up or something.
yeah. So I will say that one of the big important questions that is unanswered, and this was a big part of the study that Phil and I and Nir, the other guy, have conducted. And also, let me mention Kevin Sue and James Morandini, who have been doing another unrelated study, but also uh, one of their main goals is to try to understand why gender dysphoria develops among some AGP males and not others. It's very important, and uh, we don't know. So
Right.
the so just to throw out some possibilities, it could be that AGP is stronger in some males than in others. Uh, that for example, some males are only AGP, and other males, have both sexual attraction to others, just gynephilia, and they have also autogynephilia, and that it's less likely to develop in them. Another possibility that I'll tell you we have data for, and I think it's very interesting, and I'll be writing about this for Reality's Last Stand. There is such a thing as transgender ideology. So we have a scale, a short psychometric scale. I'll tell you some items. How much do you agree or disagree with the following items? Trans women are women. Transgender activists have done much to make the world a better place. J.K. Rowling is transphobic. Do you agree that those kind of get at transgender ideology? Okay.
Yeah.
So even statistically controlling for degree of gender dysphoria, which is measured by things. Have you ever felt frustrated that you're not a woman? Have you ever wanted to get a sex change and so on? So that's gender dysphoria. Even controlling for level of gender dysphoria, the transgender ideology scale was predictive of future transition desires. People who who tended to say trans women are women, and another item, trans women should be able to compete against natal women in competitive sports. Right. That's another item. People who agreed with those things were more likely to say that they expected to transition someday, or they already had transition.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. Did you measure that degree of belief in the transgender ideology with like the autism? Because I would sort of speculate that, like, or hypothesize that the more rigid your autistic black and white thinking, and also the moral idealism associated with autistic thinking patterns, can sort of like map onto that transgender ideology. Because I think that ideology can be very appealing to the autistic mind, because it presents these sort of like rules, and it's kind of like this orderly system of like, there's all these different non-binary identities, and they sort of like really drill into like, am I like agender, am I non-binary, am I gender queer, am I gender fluid, and there's all these rules and pronouns. It's like a very like systematic thing, and I sort of feel like that gender ideology is like attractive to autism.
So quick answer is that we can certainly look at that, and I don't remember, may have, but I don't remember. Another, I think, important finding, and you're the first to know about this, but I'll be writing about it on the Substack, and I suspect you may have a few gender critical viewers, but probably not tremendous overlap between Colin's Substack and your viewers. But anyway, we had over 400 respondents, and maybe 35% of them said, "Yeah, I'm autogynephilic."
Wow.
And the others, it's not like I necessarily believe them, but 35% said, "Yeah, I know what autogynephilia is. I'm autogynephilic," and we asked them a lot about autogynephilia. They provided consistent. The self-aware admitting autogynephiles, they were substantially lower on the transgender ideology measure compared with the others. They were not lower on gender dysphoria.
Hmm.
Their gender
Interesting.
dysphoria was just as high, but they were lower on the transgender ideology measures. And
What about IQ? Do you know if IQ is related there?
IQ is, you can't ask people what their IQ is and expect them to know. Uh, and you can't measure IQ online very easily. So no, we don't. I think we have educational level, and yeah, I don't know it
I'd be
offhand.
curious if it correlates to like a higher vocabulary test, because sometimes that's used as like a quick proxy for like IQ.
Yeah,
But I wanted to go back to the
yeah,
sort of gender critical and the ROGD, because one of the things I hear most often from gender critical women, there seems to be this strong persistent belief that there's zero genetic or hereditary component to autogynephilia, and they posit that it's always kicked off by pornography. So I wonder if you could speak to that and, sort of like
oh,
give your take on whether there is a hereditary component, if there's evidence for a hereditary
yeah,
component, if because I think coming out of the radical feminist ideology, they sort of, point to pornography as one of the most pernicious evils, and it's, and they sort of think that this whole phenomenon of autogynephilia is like driven by misogyny, pornography, and that if you don't have those things in our culture, then autogynephilia basically would never exist.
yeah. So I've always been skeptical about the idea that say sissy hypnoporn, it causes autogynephilia, rather than that autogynephilic males find sissy hypnoporn and like it, and so they watch it. I've always thought that was the more likely hypothesis, and we collected data relevant to that. I'll tell you about it in a second. Uh, but So I think what these gender criticals are doing is the opposite of a well known effect in psychology called the halo effect, which means that if you like somebody or something, you tend to see other good things in them even without evidence. And this is, I think, been called the maybe the pitchfork effect or something like that, where if you don't like something, you tend to group all other things you don't like with it. And the gender critical people, I think it's disproportionately female, and there are a lot of feminists, including radical feminists, in the group. They don't like pornography, so wouldn't it? Of course, pornography, autogynephilia, they all go together. And and pedophilia and other bad things. And again, I'll just remind everybody that I care about what's true, and if it's true, I'll I'll try to find it, and I will report it, even if it makes people mad. But in the study that I've been talking about, we collected data on the onset of autogynephilic feelings and the onset, the first time that people ever saw sissy hypnoporn, and the large majority of the time, people were aware of their autogynephilia before they ever saw any sissy hypno porn, and on
Right.
average, I think it was 4 or 5 years before. So, you know, how likely it can't have caused the AGP, and
Right.
there were a few. We asked how how do you think that sissy hypno porn caused you to become gender dysphoric? And by and large, people said no. But there were a few people who thought it did. Uh, and, I think they're likely mistaken. But
Right. Well, even if it's not necessarily, you know, that particular genre of like hypnotic suggestions or whatever, kind of encouraging transition or encouraging, you know, feminization steps, and because a lot of that stuff actually fetishizes the medical pathway, and they sort of fetishize hormones, fetishize, you know, going, you know, and fetishizing the ideological aspects of like you are a woman, and sort of in the more classical gender identity sense. But I think in a broader sense, just like exposure to not just that particular genre, but just like the proliferation of like a lot of AGPs. You know, they're doing OnlyFans, they're posting half naked selfies on Twitter and like Reddit, and so and if you go and the not safe for work side of like trans Reddit is much larger than the safe for work side. So this is a, you know, we know, you know, I think 99% of men look at pornography. Last I looked into that statistic. And so it just seems like, yeah, like the like AGPs are going to be more drawn to that because that's like what's going to draw them to it. But on the other hand, there's sort of this conception of like, well, maybe it's this all this proliferation of this content is sort of encouraging escalation, more so. So it's not like causing it, but it's like it's providing like a quick on ramp onto the full blown transition pathway, particularly for people with milder forms of dysphoria, that sort of, yeah, maybe like 20 years ago they probably would have not ever gone down or contemplated the transition pathway.
Yeah, I don't. So I definitely think that there could be pathways to transition desires that are social and experiential. We've been talking about them. I don't see how pornography per se is a likely contributor to that. Furthermore, I've had private email or Twitter discussions with some AGP people who have independently mentioned that for them, orgasm after an AGP related fantasy or pornography immediately diminished their transition desires, and which makes some sense to me, to the extent that transition desires are reflecting AGP. Then AGP is sexual arousal by the fantasy of being a woman. Then you have an orgasm. It's like analogous probably to a man who is thinking about leaving his wife and children for his mistress. I'm guessing that when he has an orgasm with his mistress, maybe right immediately afterwards is not when he is most likely to feel like, oh, I must leave my wife and kids for this mistress.
Right. There does seem to be a phenomenon that I've observed, where, yeah, you go through that binge purge cycle, and upon orgasm, you experience what people call like post nut clarity, and like you suddenly you want to like throw everything away, you just want to try and be a masculine guy, and then like maybe like a week later the urges come back. But it seems like what happens is like the interval between when the urge returns can shorten over time, so that these like binge purge cycles get shorter and shorter and shorter until eventually it's like, yes, like immediately after orgasm, you're less motivated to transition, but you're more motivated than you were like 2 years ago. And like these, and then eventually, and I sort of want to get your take on a lot of people relate their AGP experiences to a kind of like almost like a chasing dopamine highs, and then sort of there you build up a tolerance to the stimulus. You need increasingly more and more novel stimuli in order to get the same high, like the same arousal high that you got, when you first started exploring this. You sort of just, you start going to, more extreme forms of pornography, and just more and more. And then at that point, the only way to really like satisfy that like underlying craving for feminization is to do it full time, and that's kind of like the escalation pathway. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts on that analogy that people use with this kind of like dopamine tolerance idea.
So I've heard that, and what you just said sounds plausible to me, but we don't know. We don't know the extent to which that happens, and I've been thinking about ways of getting at stuff like this. So Kevin Sue and James Morandini, they're doing a longitudinal study, not a one-time survey, but survey over time, and that could possibly get at this kind of dynamic. Since the last time we surveyed you, how have you been spending your time? What have you been doing, and so on. But it's you get cause and effect issues here because if somebody's motivation to transition, if they're autogynephilic and their motivation to transition increases for whatever reason, maybe that would cause more motivation to seek out this pornography and enjoy it and so on. I just don't know. So you have very interesting and important personal experiences, which you've talked about and on your channel, and I've seen some of your interviews, but I don't remember what you have said. But if you no longer want to transition, suppose you wanted to advise an autogynephilic person who I'm strongly motivated. I'm autogynephilic. I'm strongly motivated to transition, but I really don't want to. It would really mess up my life. What should I do? What should I do different? Have you given this?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this all the time because, obviously, like in my own life, I'm trying to manage my autogynephilia and while, maintaining my male identity and trying to integrate whatever degree of feminization I can into my male identity while not, being too disruptive to my social life or my work life or, in my career and stuff. So it's about finding that balance. But I like tend to, at the end of the day, I'm like a libertarian for rational adults. They can do what they want, but I sort of like want to encourage people to sort of see the medicalization and the trans identification pathway going in, sort of taking on that identity of like, I am a trans woman, and like making that your social identity, going through legal name change and like all this stuff. I always like trying to say that that's like the absolute last resort, and like you should try your best to integrate this stuff into your life. And I think a lot of AGPs feel a lot of shame about trying to integrate bits of femininity into their life or something like this. Yeah, there's just a lot of shame, particularly since the autogynephiles are by definition straight. I think for straight males who grew up in these environments with like their, often from like more conservative religious families, and like it's hard to show that degree of gender nonconformity, just sort of like trying to alleviate your dysphoria, around your dad or whatever. You're gonna feel that like shame around your dad or something like this, or you're like conservative family. So I think that's common. I think it's just like the social script of trans women is more palatable, I think, socially, particularly if you're self-aware. I guess like if you're at work and you start, suddenly dressing in women's clothing and someone's like, well, why are you doing that? It's so much easier to give these sort of like ideological answer. Well, I'm born this way, I have this gender identity, this is my true self, versus like, yeah, I'm just like trying to express myself more in line with my sexuality, which like it's like taboo to talk about sexuality. So like people, I think that's why you're sort of like you're either assumed to be gay or you're assumed to be trans, and like that's kind of like the two options in our culture for expressing femininity. And I'm trying to change that narrative, but it's an uphill battle for sure.
Yeah, um, that's right. I agree that that is very difficult socially. People don't really, you know, they people culture has become very fascinated with transgender and the standard narrative of being a woman trapped in a man's body or whatever, and the idea that yeah, I have this sexual, I have this paraphilia that I get turned on thinking of myself as a woman. That doesn't uh, that's hard for people to understand, first of all, and people are very judgmental about
Right.
atypical sexuality. Uh, and in my book, in my book, and then subsequently, I also have speculated that that is the one reason why so many AGPs resist admitting that they're AGP, and the other is, more fundamental, that they really, really, really want to believe that they are a woman trapped in a man's body, and they have a
Right.
female brain, and the idea of AGP as a paraphilia, that it's an unusual sexuality, but it's not really anything like what women have.
Right.
That's a narcissistic injury that they resist.
Right. I do think it's interesting that there are a number of AGPs who will say things like, is it normal that I still feel like a man inside, or I don't feel like a woman? So I would sort of I'm like kind of a little bit skeptical that this sort of like the story that all these AGPs always want to fully strongly identify as women. I feel like that's sort of like buying into the gender ideology to some extent. Like there's like the social pressure to do so, because in these communities they're often very ideologically aligned, left of center politically, and there's sort of like a group thing such that if you deviate from that narrative that trans women are women, and that that the explanation for why you feel this thing is that you have a gender identity of a woman on the inside and you're supposed to feel like a woman, then if you deviate from that social script, it's very easy to get canceled and ostracized within these communities. And since they're trying to find a sense of community in the first place, they don't want to do anything to jeopardize their in-group belonging. So they virtue signal the appropriate ideological script in order to say like, yes, don't cancel me. I'm a member of good standing in this like progressive circle of like trans people who all buy into the ideology. But I think there's actually a large contingent who, at the beginning of their transition, they don't necessarily psychologically align with that ideological position that they feel like a woman on the inside, but they kind of just like over time they kind of like trick themselves into believing that, because that's just the social script, and they just internalize that social script over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you know, to go back to one of my goals and one of our findings. So I believe that self-aware AGPs, first of all, I don't know of any self-aware AGPs who behave badly toward women or to scientists who study AGP. It's the AGPs in denial, uh, in my experience, who certainly have attacked me. And I think the one also, I'm guessing the ones who went after Kelly J. Keene and others were not people who said, "Yeah, I'm AGP," but I'm going to dump paint on you or whatever they did. Uh, and Phil and I found that self-aware AGPs were lower on this gender ideology scale, much noticeably lower. You could see it with the naked eye. They also are less likely to want to transition. So I believe that gender criticals should stop painting with so broad a brush and demonizing all AGPs. I think that self-aware AGPs are potential allies of the gender critical. Also, their sons, if they have ROGD sons, are likely to be AGP, and if they don't want them to transition, then it seems like maybe one thing that might help is to make them self-aware AGPs because they seem to be less likely to want to transition.
So shifting gears a little bit, I want to jump more into like the professional academic world and the status of academia, or the status of autogynephilia as a concept, because in her recent big report, Dr. Hilary Cass, zero mention of autogynephilia, and she attempted to lay out this objective, truth-based, empirical approach that talks about and it's not like she didn't talk about ideological factors, because she talked about the ideological factors in the females in regards to positing RGD or as like a possible hypothesis or stuff like this. But like there's a distinct absence of the term autogynephilia as an ideological factor in the development of male gender dysphoria, which is ironic because she's doing a scientific review, and that is the concept with the most scientific evidence supporting it as like a causal factor in gender dysphoria. So it's like, why do you think even someone like Dr. Hilary Cass, who it is not a TRA, not bought into this stuff, do you think that was just like a political calculation because it would have made it even more controversial, or do you think I'm kind of curious your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's awful that autogynephilia has been relegated outside of this discussion, except by people who want to hate all autogynephiles. And yes, I was disappointed in the Cass review for that reason, even though it's a very valuable review, and the world is better that it was written, but it would have been even better if they had addressed autogynephilia. I think people don't want to go there for understandable reasons. They look at what happens to people who write about it. I'm Exhibit A, my book Controversy, and I suppose they knew they were going to be attacked by the other side. They did mention, though did not embrace the concept of ROGD. They mentioned it as a possibility, although I don't know, they kind of criticized it at one point, I think. But had they also mentioned AGP, they would have been attacked by the other side that much harder. Now, I'm not sure why they cared that much. They were going to be attacked anyway.
Right.
Yeah. So I will say that the DSM-5, which is the psychiatric manual that includes gender dysphoria, does explicitly mention autogynephilia in a couple of places. It's not a diagnosis, but it mentions autogynephilia as I don't know if they use the term risk factor for gender dysphoria, but and also something associated with transvestism. So the DSM mentions it, although will it stay in there with the next version the way the medical profession is going? I wouldn't bet on it. So it is quite frustrating, and I'm the small contingent of AGP researchers, me and Kevin Sue and James Morandini, and also, perhaps I will collaborate still more with Phil. We're trying to keep it. We're trying to elevate it to its rightful place.
Right.
The world is obsessed with transgender right now, and the science of gender dysphoria has become quite important. If you look at the amount of space devoted to it, both in scientific publications and in mainstream media, and yet autogynephilia is not being mentioned, and that is to its detriment because it's very important.
Right. So, speaking of the trans activists trying to demonize this, painting it as pseudoscientific, um, or they're sort of trying to dismiss this. If you go into Reddit and you go into these trans feminine subreddits and you type in, "Is it just a fetish?" and you see all these threads where the people are asking that question, and there's always at the top of the top comment is always this like small handful of articles that get shared whenever people ask these questions in regards to clearly describing classical autogynephilic experiences and then asking whether this makes them trans or not, or what makes sense. There's always a few articles shared, and the articles and the argument of the articles sort of comes like it's like a Julius Serrano type argument where they say like the reason why a lot of trans women start off their gender exploration in the realm of sexuality is because it's essentially like the only safe outlet, or it's like a coping mechanism because it's easier to explore or to express your innate gender identity through the realm of sexuality and in the bedroom. But as soon as you like accept yourself, then you don't need that outlet anymore, that coping mechanism. So they won't deny that a lot of trans women start off in this like sexual fantasy world, but they'll just say that like, well, the reason, the like root cause for that sexual exploration is the underlying innate gender identity, the like neurological brain sex, or as Julius Serrano calls it, your subconscious sex, or this feminine essence idea, born in the wrong body. So they kind of flip the causality and say like it's the innate gender identity that causes the development of the autogynephilia, but that's just kind of like a temporary holdover to do your exploration until you discover your true authentic gender identity, and then the sexuality stuff falls away and you just embrace as your true self, and you start living as a woman. So I'm curious like what your argument would be to that style of argumentation, which is incredibly common as far as like trying to debunk that theory.
First of all, that is a very Serrano is, whenever I've tried to read her, I find her very unclear and vague. And Anne Lawrence has a wonderful paper that I don't know if you can link to things underneath your YouTube page, but if you can, I'll send you a link.
Yes, I can.
She has a fantastic paper where she, I would say, effectively debunks Serrano and her ilk, Moser and all. So, there's the theory of autogynephilia that those of us who actually do empirical work on it mostly work with is that it's in the genre of erotic target. Well, I'll say erotic target identity inversion. That is more applicable to autogynephilic gender dysphoria. In a recent paper, I'll also send you a link to. We think that the best terminology for autogynephilia per se is an internalized sexual attraction. One is sexually attracted to an internalized image of oneself as a woman. And again, autogynephilia is a major cause of gender dysphoria among males, but not all males with autogynephilia have much, if any, gender dysphoria. So autogynephilia is a sexuality that sometimes causes gender dysphoria. So,
right.
you have these cases of autogynephilia without men wanting to get sex changes, and it's the same phenomenon as occurs in trans women. So, I think Serrano's hypothesis has trouble explaining why the same sexuality occurs in the group she wants to explain and in a separate group. Also, internalized sexuality and erotic target identity inversions occur in very different groups, like men who are sexually attracted to amputees. Well, it happens that a subgroup of them also have a very analogous internalized sexual attraction. They are sexually aroused by the image of themselves as an amputee. And some of them will develop dysphoria and actually seek amputations. Same with men who are attracted to animals. A subgroup of them develop this internalized attraction to the image of themselves as animals. And our paper with the other group we studied was men who are sexually attracted by morbidly obese people. And these are normal weight men, and they're attracted to people weighing 500 pounds. And a subgroup of them have this internalized attraction to the image of themselves as being morbidly obese. And one common correlate in these three groups, they are all the guys who had the internalized attractions were higher in autogynephilia as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So speaking of,
I just don't think Serrano can account for any of that where we can.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and yet they so arrogantly say that what you are doing is pseudoscience, and what Serrano's doing is like the real empirical deal. It's so ironic.
Yeah.
But going further into the concept of paraphilias, I'm like curious about your recent paper about paraphilia as a natural kind, because I was actually had my interview with Dr. Blanchard earlier today, and I asked him, like, what is a paraphilia? And he sort of said there's two schools of thought. And one school of thought was pretty much anything that's not heterosexual vanilla sex that leads to reproduction is just a paraphilia by definition, which kind of lumps in everything that's not straightforwardly evolutionary connected to your like reproductive fitness. But then you said you have a sort of different school of thought or a different opinion where you sort of like think that a paraphilia is a natural kind that's distinct from other non-vanilla heterosexual sex, like homosexuality. So there'd be the vanilla heterosexuality, things like homosexuality, and then this distinct class of things called paraphilias. So I'm curious if you can speak to your research on paraphilia as like a natural kind, because I find that really interesting. But it's kind of like that paper is like kind of technical, and I think a lot of people
Yeah.
aren't going to be able to understand that. So if
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
like like spell it out in layman's term, that'd be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll just, I'll try, and I think I can. So, yeah, there's kind of been this tradition that of people used to use the word perversion. I think that was actually an early uh, version of the DSM, and I believe in that maybe homosexuality was in it too. And basically, perversion meant some kind of unusual sexuality that we don't like. And homosexuality has been excluded from the DSM, and its exclusion was mainly done for politics. And by the way, I'm fine with it being excluded. I also think the DSM is partly a political document, because anything that we decide that we're okay with and doesn't seem to cause any harm, it's going to get eliminated from the DSM. I'm fine with that. So I believe that paraphilia is a useful category that is not just arbitrary. It doesn't just mean an unusual sexuality that we don't like. I think it has some other interesting properties that we don't fully understand, but suggest that there may be like some biological commonality among different paraphilias. The two properties that come to mind, first of all, paraphilias are much, much, much more common among natal males than among natal females. So much so that, I'm kind of skeptical in if what happens in natal females is the same as what happens in natal males. So natal females, there are some who say that they're attracted to children in the same way that male pedophiles are. I'm skeptical. The other thing is that at least some paraphilias tend to occur together. That is, if a man has paraphilia A, then the chances are much greater that he will have paraphilia B than if he didn't have paraphilia A. For our present conversation, the two that go together are autogynephilia and masochism. And that has been observed for a while, and Ray has done some of the studies. The most dramatic example is autoerotic asphyxia, which is a sexual practice that is motivated by masochism, in which a man, almost always it's a man, for masochistic reasons, he strangles himself, I guess often by hanging himself with a noose. They don't mean to kill themselves, but sometimes they fall unconscious, and before they can, put their feet back on the stool, they fall unconscious and they die. And about a third of the time, when these death scenes of autoerotic asphyxia are found, the man shows signs of autogynephilia. He is either cross-dressed, wearing a bra, panties, or has fingernail polish or something like that. A third of the time, a third of men are not autogynephilic. Right. So there's something that seems to be in common and I don't think it's the actual expression of the paraphilias. I don't think there's anything about masochism that you know uh, is autogynephilic, or anything about autogynephilia that's masochistic per se, but they tend to go together. And I've replicated that association in a BDSM sample, and there's a pretty there's a moderate to strong association between autogynephilia and masochism, and in this sample, AGPs are less sadistic than the rest of the guys. They're masochistic, not sadistic.
Right.
So, and as I said, we have an association between AGP, say, and interest in being an amputee. And so first of all, there are many, many different paraphilias or sexual interests labeled as paraphilias. In a Wikipedia page, I think there's maybe a couple hundred of them. And do they just consist of, is it just an arbitrary classification where these are just weird sexuality that, make us feel kind of creepy? Or do they have some underlying vulnerability? And I think that the latter hypothesis has promise. That's what our paper was about. And we studied 10 different paraphilias, and including autogynephilia. We had a psychometric scale, and we found that on average, men in the paraphilias were higher on this scale compared with men who were recruited just for being kind of typical, or they were not recruited for having paraphilias. So we found this difference, and it was a large difference on this scale. And the best items, it's a 3-item scale. You can, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is the maximum, 1 is the minimum, how sexually exciting is the idea of cross-dressing? How sexually exciting is, how sexually aroused are you to some, no, I'm sorry. Another one, how sexually aroused are you by the idea of being humiliated by your sex partner? So you add those together, and then you subtract the following. How sexually arousing is it? The idea of watching somebody you're sexually attracted to undress. So that contrast separated these two groups pretty well. And the latter, the voyeurism item, I think worked because most men, find that idea to be kind of arousing. Whereas right. most men are not very sexually aroused by the idea of cross-dressing or being sexually humiliated by their sex partner. So anyway, that scale formed by those 3 items seems to have something in common among the paraphilic groups that we studied. And I suspect that, so no direct evidence for this, that the brains of paraphilic men have something in common that probably emerged developmentally quite early, that is not present in the brains of men with typical sexuality. You asked before, and I didn't answer, about genetics. We don't really know about genetics of paraphilias per se, but there are case reports that are suggestive that there's something going on.
Yeah,
for
there does seem to be
yeah,
a number of stories of like father passing it down to
yeah,
son.
yeah,
I've heard a number of anecdotes, but yeah,
yeah.
I've never seen any hard data on that.
Yeah, Ken Zucker published a fascinating case history, and I think Ray Blanchard was a co-author. Uh, so they were treating this very young boy. I think he was 4, who was he was getting erections when wearing his mother's panties, and he was brought to Zucker's gender clinic, and in a separate session with the boy's father, because they sometimes see the parents, the father revealed that he was a cross-dresser and that the rest of the family didn't know about this. Uh, so when I told that uh, story, it's a case history to a gender critical audience, some of them objected. Well, that isn't that evidence that the father was sexually abusing the child, or that the child saw the father do it and didn't say it. No. No, it's that those no, it's not evidence for that. It's most likely that something genetic is going on that was present obviously in the son and the father.
Right. So one of the big debates in the sort of gender critical world right now is a sort of pushback against, certain people like Phil Illy who are kind of trying to push this idea that autogynephilia is akin to a sexual orientation. And they sort of and there seems a lot of people playing these semantic games of like, is it a paraphilia? Is it an orientation? Is it both?
No,
Uh,
they say it's a fetish is the word
Yeah, they say it's like it's like a fetish, and also there's like this other argument that's like, well, given that sexual orientation is a legally protected category, if the scientists come out and say, hey, all this other stuff is in the same category as orientations, then suddenly we're now providing like legal protections for things like necrophilia or pedophilia or something like this. So they sort of say that like, well, by talking about autogynephilia in these terms, even if you're doing it scientifically, it provides like a slippery slope politically. And it seems like people are very reluctant to draw a sharp line between purely scientific objective description of reality versus like the potential pragmatic consequences of that research as it gets taken up by policy making or like social arrangements or something like this. And so I'm curious if you could sort of clarify whether this is all just semantics. Does it really matter if it's like an orientation or it's not an orientation, or are we just like what's going on in that debate? I would love to get your take on it.
Yeah, I've briefly had some arguments on Twitter about this topic, and when I realized that the people who were arguing with me did not have uh, open minds and goodwill, I just ended it. There's no point. So, sexual orientation is really it's a term that has been used primarily to reflect to mean attraction to men versus attraction to women, and obviously, if we want to restrict it to that, we can. There's no reason why we have to broaden it, but the researcher and clinical psychologist Michael Cito, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, wrote a paper about whether pedophilia is a sexual orientation. And he's very, pro, he's been the president of ATSA, the treatment of sexual offenders. He's definitely not pro adults having sex with children. He's protect the children, But he, in his article, he did. He said, it's reasonable to think of pedophilia as a sexual orientation, and it depends what you mean. And rather than get into these arguments, I guess I've decided that the best approach for me anyway, and I think for scientists, say, well, what here are the characteristics of autogynephilia that are shared with conventional sexual orientation. It emerges early in adolescence, just like conventional sexual orientation or sexual orientation conventionally understood. It's very difficult or perhaps impossible to change, to change to a different sexual orientation. Gosh, I forget what other. Those are the two that I would start with,
Right.
And also it's strongly motivating for men. So some men, for example, they might have a strong preference for blonde-haired women, but probably if you gave them the opportunity to have sex with a very attractive dark-haired woman, they would take it if they were available. Or if you hooked them up to a plethysmograph and showed them pornography with a dark-haired woman, they would still get erections.
Right.
But autogynephilia is extremely motivating of particular behaviors and outcomes.
Right. So one of the consistent criticisms I see of you from the gender critical side is that somehow they say that you have apologized or excused um, these like bad behavior of the AGP, and from the gender critical radical position or the like radical feminist position, where it's like they want to keep all males out of female spaces, regardless of whether or not they're passable or blend in or assimilate or don't cause any disruptions in the spaces. So they'll say like, well, this approach of like clinical management, focusing on like the patient's needs and sort of conceptualizing at the patient level, not really informing the patient of like the ethical concerns about, these like social policies of like using female spaces and stuff. They'll say like, you guys have been like negligent to the social implications of what's happening within the therapy room. I mean, I know you're not a clinician, so I'm just trying to like steel man their argument here in terms of like, do we have like an obligation to sort of discourage that ideological identification that feels that makes AGPs feel entitled to use female spaces, or are you agnostic on that, or do you have a sort of a sort of, because that seems to be the big issue. It's not just that the AGPs are deciding to on a libertarian basis modify their own bodies, and that's like their right to my body my choice, and they're going to take hormones, but they're going to otherwise live as men. But it's like the problem seems to be that the transition pathway and the medical pathway kind of encourages living as a woman or attempting to live as a woman, which involves getting all these ethical controversies and stuff. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to that objection, because I see it all the time, and I think it's a little unfair. But I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that directly.
Yeah. So, right. First, I'm not a clinician, although when I wrote my book, I did find a lot of wisdom in the clinicians that I talked about most, which were Ken Zucker and Ray Blanchard has done clinical work. Um, um, so that's number one. Number two, I've never advocated for uh, trans women to be able uh, to have a right to space for natal women. Uh, I remember the Michigan Music, Michigan
Yeah, the Mishfest.
Festival. I remember back when trans women were trying to, get in there, and I never thought that they should have that right if the women there didn't want it. I think people demanding, yeah, pretty libertarian in terms of, who the freedom of association. I do think that, so I think it's I don't think Phil Illey forced himself into GenSpect, and I wasn't there. My understanding from everybody that I've heard is that he was, very nice and not creepy, and unless you necessarily find a man wearing a dress creepy, in which case, he was wearing a dress. I So I think there are two other issues I want to address here and distinguish. First, is it the fault of people like Ray Blanchard and Ken Zucker, but really their predecessors who started transition, medicalized gender transition, and social transition? Uh, uh, is it their fault that we have this recent crisis? And I would say no, it's not. I think until fairly recently, people were saying about this, and the rate of surgeries and so on was very rare. Pretty recently, the estimate of the rate of transsexualism was, like 1 in 20,000 or something like that. And you had to be adults. Where Ken and Ray did their work, there was quite a bit of oversight. You had to live as the other sex for, I don't know, was it a year or two before you could get access to hormones and surgery. And these were people who had an extended history of gender dysphoria and being unable to overcome it in other ways. And I think that Ray believes, and I think it's true, that we don't know how to treat autogynephilia. We don't know how to make it go away. Right. And these were people who they had tried other ways of treating their gender dysphoria, and it didn't work. And so he thought it was humane and to give them what they want. And right. There were, all these conditions. They didn't have the right to do whatever they wanted. And there weren't big problems until the world went insane. And the world did not just go insane about trans issues. The world went insane about all the issues, race,
right.
And so on. And the world went insane in the early 2010s. And people stopped. We stopped valuing genuine intellectual expertise and rational dialogue, and we started elevating social justice ends and people screaming until they got their way. That is the
Right.
cause of the current crisis. And
Yeah.
I also want to address, so what is the best way going forward now? Because we have this crisis now. What is the best way going forward? I don't know. It is possible that, you know, it is possible that making gender transition harder to get, I mean, especially, I do not think that presently we should be allowing gender transition, or I don't think evidence supports the desirability for gender transitioning youth. I could imagine it would be uh, better to discourage gender transition. I could imagine. I'm not saying we should. I could imagine. I'm
Right.
open minded. Let's talk and stop screaming.
Right. I certainly think, you know, we need to change sort of the assumptions in regards to what's like the first line protocol treatment for AGP, because right now it's like within the trans community, within these gender clinics, it's like as soon as you show up on the door with, you know, AGP generated dysphoria, they just like, okay, well, just try hormones and see how you like it. And sometimes I've even seen it used almost like a diagnostic device. It's like, I don't know if I'm trans or not. They're like, and then other uh AGPs are like encouraging them to like, well, just go on hormones for a little bit and see if you like it. And if you do like it, that's proof you're really trans. If you don't like it, then you can go off and there's no big deal. And I think we're so readily jumping into making oneself a lifelong medical patient, and you're on these drugs for your life. Eventually you're going to have an orchiectomy, so you don't have to be on the testosterone blockers, and we're, you know, and then there's all sorts of problems. And often the benefits that they want from these drugs, many of them are actually ambivalent about even wanting breasts, but they want the smooth skin or and it's like, and like, in my opinion, we should be pushing for things like permanent hair removal as a first step and see if that kind of satisfies, you know, the desire, helps like alleviate the dysphoria, and they can kind of like, you know, feel better, feel more pretty, you know, because in my opinion, hormones do very little for feminization. And it's almost always like things like growing your hair out or doing your eyebrows or getting your beard lasers off and stuff. That seems to have a more positive effect. But I think we kind of, there's kind of like this script of like, okay, you come out as a trans woman, you get a Planned Parenthood, informed consent, you get your dosage, and it's all sort of formulaic, and we're not kind of catering our like treatments, and so that's one thing I'm trying to do on my channel, is to sort of provide, you know, non-medicalized options, and like encouraging people to, you know, like, yeah, you can just be a cross-dresser and you can get a lot of your satisfaction of your autogynephilic desires without, you know, going through the headaches of like a legal name change. Like legal name changes are so it's like, I don't know why anyone would subject themselves to that headache if they can avoid it. And I think
Yeah,
people aren't trying hard enough to avoid it, because this pathway is just encouraged as the only possible way to treat this stuff.
I 100% agree. I think I think that being able to say it is better not to transition if you can avoid it and be happy enough. And you know, what we really would love would be a randomized control trial, which, you know, it it could be done. It won't be done. It could be done because, you know, otherwise people who do transition, they have, you know, people who make a decision, they tend to make up, they tend to want to rationalize the decision and say, yeah, that was the best decision. I would have killed myself if I hadn't transitioned. I hear that a lot. I hear that a lot.
Right.
But
I think that's a meme. I think that's
yeah,
often like a meme. That's just like,
yeah.
you're supposed to say that, and then you kind of internalize that, and you kind of retcon your own like
but yeah,
distress.
you know, to gender critical parents they clearly don't want their kids to transition, and I agree with them. I wouldn't either. But what is the best way not to have their autogynephilic son transition? I suspect the first two steps are to get him to realize that he has autogynephilia and what that means.
Right. I mean, I've literally had dysphoric males reach out to me and say that them watching my channel and learning to accept that, hey, what they have is an unusual sexual interest called autogynephilia has actually like directly prevented them from pursuing a medicalized transition pathway, because they sort of so I definitely think you're right that self-awareness, it's not just some epiphenomenon that doesn't do anything. The self-awareness directly changes behavior, and it changes motivation, and it kind of like reorients you to like, you know, like try and integrate this more into like your like natal sex, which I think is, preferable. But the transactionists don't like this because say, well, you're doing conversion therapy because you're trying to argue people out of a trans identity or something. And I know just even saying that, I'm going to get the Trevor Project window from YouTube, warning, saying like, oh, like, these guys are trying to convert you, or trying to, trying to stop you from being your authentic self.
Sorry, I don't worry about trans activists, but I guess because I don't. I guess you have to.
Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to ask you about more sort of theoretically in regards to whether or not there can be purely androphilic AGP males. Like, so they are only have ever been attracted to men. They've never shown, romantic or sexual interest in women. Do you think that is theoretically compatible with that pure androphilia being driven ideologically from a erotic target inversion of heterosexuality?
No, I don't. I don't. Theoretically, no. It makes no sense. As a scientist, I have to be open-minded to being wrong, and I know a particular person. Maybe we know, or I don't know if you're thinking of a particular person who has insisted this is possible, but I am, and they thought that there was somebody that they could send to my lab and be tested, and that would show that it was possible. It never happened. Actually, I think I know who this person is too, and I don't think it's possible. Obviously, we are both aware of what I call, and Ray Blanchard calls, pseudo bisexuality, which is sexual arousal by AGP males by the fantasy or act of having sex with men, but it's not sexual arousal by the male body. It's sexual arousal by the role of being a female.
Right. Well, let me give you like a case study. I met someone in real life who identified as a gay man, had been married openly to another gay man for like 12 years. And, if you just looked at him, you would assume, typical gay guy, just a regular homosexual, and the sort of the thinking is homosexuals aren't attracted to, trans women. They're only attracted to like the masculine body. They're attracted to men. And they're not, and they don't have this, sort of cross gender arousal that you see, or like interest in transvestism and stuff that you see in the AGP cohort. But with this guy, he admitted to me that he's attracted to trans women, like the transsexuals, and he likes to cross dress. But he's like, from the outside, you would just think, this is just a regular homosexual man. So, why would they show the same sort of patterns of behavior? And it's sort of this idea that like being gay can become almost like a social identity. And so, and then the other idea I see, people talking about in the sort of like self-aware AGP space, where we're all just sort of theorizing and speculating about this stuff, kind of, they're like, well, if the pseudo bisexuality is like so strong, or in some cases that pseudo bisexuality or meta attraction can be so strong, it presents as like the dominant sexual interest. You just sort of super lean into that meta attraction, and like superficially that looks like homosexuality, but like underlying it's actually just someone who's like leaned so far into their meta attraction that like socially it looks as if they're homosexual.
Yeah, I that would be unusual, but I could, the latter makes theoretical sense.
Yeah. Well, people try and like develop this theory to account for in those original studies, where you sort of distinguish the homosexuals from the asexual, bisexual, and heterosexual in terms of like whether or not they ever have a history of arousal at cross gender fantasy or whatever. And it's like in 15% of the purely androphilic cases, you did see that history of arousal, and then also in like the flip side, not all heterosexuals or not all gynophilic transsexuals reported a like history. So people have always said like pseudo bisexuality is like the like theoretical answer for why you could have some androphilic people reporting this like arousal, or the like same patterns that you see in the AGP.
Yeah. So in the wonderful article by Anne Lawrence that I am going to send you and you are going to post, she addresses these apparent exceptions, and has much the take I would or have, which is, these are self-reports, and self-reports have error, and we're talking about autogynephilia, even back in the Blanchard day. There's all kinds of denial going on, and and wish fulfillment. And I'm not that kind of transsexual. I'm the good kind, or whatever. Right. So so it is my approach as a scientist, and I think it's a good approach. It doesn't make me popular, and it is to be skeptical about reports that are highly contradictory to my priors. Right. And I am going to need, and I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind very publicly. For example, I don't know if you know that in 2005 we published a paper in which we failed to find evidence for bisexual arousal patterns in males, and it was in the New York Times, which was a big deal back then, and it made a lot of people mad. And we kept studying it, and accumulating data. And then in 2020, published a big study of all the data that we had showing that, in fact, we found male bisexual arousal pattern. That paper got hardly any publicity.
Interesting.
Because I think people don't want to hear from me anymore. But anyway, I changed my mind with data, but it takes data, and it takes data that convince me, and my priors are usually right. uh,
Right.
so yeah.
So if you look on Wikipedia, and you sort of look up either you or Michael Bailey, and we all know Wikipedia is run by very woke people these days. There's a lot of, but they sort of try and connect you and your research to these other controversial researchers, human biodiversity, and they kind of connect you to these right wing, what they tried to paint as pseudoscientific, discredited, or like the bigoted science or something, and they're trying to lump autogynephilic research in the same category of saying like, well, all this research is motivated by a fundamental animus of transphobia and bigotry and hatred of trans women. They're just trying to like, they're only doing this research to like, demonize, just like, they'll say like, well, with the human biodiversity stuff, all that's only motivated by, some kind of like white supremacy or like, some kind of underlying racist motivation. And so I'm curious, like your response, or like how you sort of like handled that, or like what you would say in regards to
Yeah,
like they're trying to lump you in with research like that.
yeah. So that's it's an ad hominem approach, and that's what people do when they don't have good arguments. I take every intellectual issue uh, separately. I don't take any uh, position. I don't take any strong positions in which I lack expertise, and I don't take any strong positions for political rather than scientific reasons. And I have other controversial scientific opinions, and I don't really want to list them all here, but none
Yeah.
of them are because I hate anybody, or I follow anybody and want to be like them. The
Right.
Human Biodiversity Group is never existed. There was a listserv that used to be run by Steve Saylor, who is somebody who has been demonized uh, by the left, and he's he's more conservative than I am, but he's a smart guy, and he's not a bad man. He has a lot of beliefs. He doesn't have beliefs. He has come up with a lot of findings that I think are well done and interesting. I've learned
Right.
things from reading him, and there's this tendency that is bad, even in academia, even in people who I respect. It's like it's the cooties approach. I can't be associated with this person because and I am I you know I suppose if Hitler were still around, maybe I would draw the line, even if he said something I agreed with. But I would never be associated with him. But anyway, Steve Saylor is far from Hitler, and
Right.
it,
It like does seem like that scientific attitude of just like, is increasingly becoming rare within academia. I feel like all the, the like vanguard of intellectualism these days is kind of being done outside of the walls of academia, where certain questions just you're not supposed to ask them in the halls of academia. Otherwise, you're gonna get canceled and and stuff like this. One final question, and then I want to wrap it up because I know you've been very generous with your time.
I've enjoyed talking to you, and I really appreciate what you're doing. It's for the good, and yeah. And
thank you. I appreciate that. So last question. I know a lot of my audience is very fond of the sort of theory of autoandrophilia, the sort of flip side of AGP in females. And I know you've been publicly skeptical of this. I think one of the reasons you've said you're skeptical is you don't think the females are sufficiently paraphilic to make this like an analogous phenomenon with what's going on in the AGP case. But I'm wondering, like, what would change your mind? Like, what would be the piece of evidence or set of evidence that you would need to convince you that this is like a real phenomenon? Because we already have, case reports. There's a growing collection of like self-aware, self-identified, females who say that this concept, makes sense to them of like their lives, and so there's already kind of like the like case studies to generate the hypothesis. But what would be the smoking gun in like your mind in terms of like convincing you that this is like a real phenomenon that's driving gender dysphoria in females?
Okay, that's not the way science can always work. I mean, sometimes it can, but what's the piece of information or the data? That would change your mind? I don't know. I don't know. That's often the case. I will say what the accumulated data I'm not impressed with. What I was just talking about priors, and autoandrophilia is strongly against my priors. Females, I've done a fair amount of research in female sexual orientation, and it's organized quite differently than male sexual orientation. We don't get strong arousal patterns in women. And if I were going to expect anything like autoandrophilia, it should be it should happen among lesbians, but that wouldn't really make sense. I say that because lesbians are the ones who sometimes have stronger arousal patterns.
Right.
But I'm not done. And I'm fond of Phil. I'm collaborating with him, but I don't like what Phil's doing with autoandrophilia. So, okay, he has tried to make a case by, accumulating potential writings from everywhere. I don't think he's written a very balanced account on these. Like, where could I be wrong? And like, it seems like every week I see Phil like broadcasting on Twitter, like, yes, autoandrophilia is a thing. If you are a trans man, you're probably autoandrophilic. And look, I have evidence for, and everybody else has evidence for the ROGD epidemic among natal females. And so these are people who've talked themselves into believing that they have always been, that they are trans, that they should get sex changes. And we're gonna, on the basis of what these people are saying to Phil and others, we're going to say, oh yeah, I believe in autoandrophilia. And something else I've said to Phil, and you just talked to Ray Blanchard, came up with the idea of autogynephilia. He used to treat female to males in his clinic. He is going to do this for a decade and not notice autoandrophilia? I don't think so. So I think it's unlikely, and what is being thrown at me as data for autoanthrophilia, I find entirely unconvincing. So your turn.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to push you on this. I think that would probably
you can push me, but
I think that would be an entirely separate conversation.
Okay.
And I just want to get your official take. And yeah, I think this is gonna be interesting as it plays out. I think, you know, yeah, this like certainly seems to be an idea that's popular within the sort of like amateur, you know, amongst the amateurs who aren't, you know, professional academics.
Yeah, you get more and more of natal females the same who you know believe they have Tourette's and some of, I think multiple personality disorders coming back among some of them. You know, that's why I don't know what would convince me, but self-reports are among this cohort, and especially without considering alternative explanations.
Right. Well, thank you, Dr. Bailey. This has been an enlightened 2-hour conversation. I think I like really enjoyed it, and yeah, and I would love to have you back more.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, yes, I'm continuing research in this area, and it's a very hot scientific area, and there's a lot of important stuff we don't really know still. We need more people interested, although, you know, we have a good group. We need funding. So if you have any wealthy AGP viewers, contact us. And you know, I'm for the truth, but I'm also for decency and kindness, and I consider you to be a decent and kind person, and I wish more people on both sides treated you that way.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. All right, I'm going to end the recording, and then I'll see you on the other side of the studio.
Okay.